The blacksmith's hammer froze mid-swing, the sound of metal on metal dying in the desert air as Dakota Mitchell watched his 8-year-old son reach for the stranger's outstretched hand. 6 months of absolute silence, and now this. The woman wasn't from their town. Nobody in Copper Ridge had ever seen her weathered face or those knowing eyes that seemed to read pain like scripture. Mrs. Henderson dropped her school books, papers scattering across the dusty ground like startled birds. Grandfather Mape's weathered hands trembled against his walking stick as he whispered ancient words under his breath. Where once Ayanna had recoiled from every touch, every attempt at comfort since his mother's burial, now his small fingers intertwined with this mysterious woman's calloused palm without hesitation. The boy who hadn't spoken his own name in half a year suddenly looked alive. "Sweet Jesus," someone breathed from the church steps. Who was she, and how did she know exactly what his broken child needed? More importantly, what would happen when the town discovered the truth about why she'd really come to Copper Ridge? Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The sun beat down mercilessly on Copper Ridge, Arizona territory in the summer of 1887, turning the adobe buildings into ovens and the copper mine into a furnace that had already claimed too many lives. This town of 847 souls clung to the desert like a stubborn weed, sustained by the red ore buried deep in the earth and the desperate hope that tomorrow might bring better fortune than today. Dakota Mitchell had built his life around the rhythm of hammer on anvil, the hiss of red-hot metal meeting water, and the satisfaction of creating something useful from raw iron. At 35, his hands bore the scars of his trade, burns, cuts, and calluses that told the story of every horseshoe, every door hinge, every piece of metalwork that kept this frontier town functioning. The blacksmith shop had been his sanctuary, a place where problems could be solved with heat and force, where broken things could be made whole again. But 6 months ago, cholera had swept through Copper Ridge like the angel of death, and among its victims was Sarah Mitchell, the woman whose laughter had filled their small adobe house with warmth that no desert sun could match. She'd died holding Dakota's hand, whispering promises about watching over their boy from wherever good mothers go when their work on earth is done. Ayanna had been 8 years old when they lowered his mother into the hard desert ground, 8 years old when he spoke his last words at her graveside, "Mama, don't leave me here alone." Since that day, the boy who had once chattered like a magpie about everything from cloud shapes to the habits of desert lizards had retreated into a silence so complete it felt like another death in the family. The town's doctor, a gin-soaked man named Hartwell, who'd fled some unnamed disgrace back east, had examined the boy thoroughly and pronounced his condition a mystery. "Grief has locked his voice away," he'd said, accepting Dakota's last silver dollars with hands that shook from more than just age. "Sometimes children just go quiet. Might come back tomorrow. Might never come back at all." Mrs. Henderson, the school teacher who'd taught 3 generations of Copper Ridge children to read and cipher, had tried everything she could think of. She'd brought picture books, colored chalks, even a small harmonica that had belonged to her own departed son. Nothing. Ayanna would sit in the back of the one-room schoolhouse, staring at nothing, responding to nothing, as if his spirit had followed his mother into whatever comes after. The other children had tried too. At first, they'd offered marbles, shared their lunches, invited him to their games of kick the can in the dusty streets. But children, with their brutal honesty about the world's harsh realities, eventually grew tired of talking to silence and moved on to companions who could laugh at their jokes and share their secrets. Dakota worked longer hours now, partly to escape the crushing quiet of his home, partly because the medical bills from Sarah's final illness had left him owing money to half the town. She appeared on a Tuesday morning like a mirage that refused to disappear when you looked directly at it. Winona Hart stepped off the weekly supply wagon with nothing but a worn leather satchel and the kind of quiet dignity that comes from having lost everything and somehow finding the strength to keep walking anyway. The desert dust clung to her simple brown dress, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical bun that had seen too many hard miles, but there was something about her face, something familiar that made people look twice without knowing why. "Just passing through," she told Jeremiah Walsh, the wagon driver, when he offered to wait while she decided her business. "But I might stay if there's work to be found." Jeremiah scratched his grizzled beard and glanced around the dusty main street. "Ain't much call for ladies' work in a mining town, miss. Most folks here can barely keep themselves fed, let alone hire help." Winona nodded as if she'd expected as much. "I'm not particular about the work. Cleaning, cooking, mending, whatever needs doing." She paused, her eyes scanning the scattered buildings until they settled on the small adobe house behind the blacksmith shop. "Sometimes people need help more than they realize." Word of the stranger spread through Copper Ridge faster than wildfire in dry grass. By noon, half the town knew about the woman asking for work, and by evening, the other half had formed their own opinions about what kind of woman travels alone in the Arizona Territory without a husband, family, or visible means of support. Eleanor Blackwood, the wealthiest widow in 3 counties and owner of the copper mine that employed most of the town's men, watched from her large adobe mansion as Winona walked slowly down the main street. Eleanor's calculating eyes took in every detail: the woman's confident bearing despite her obvious poverty, the way she moved like someone accustomed to hard work, and most importantly, the way she paused to study the blacksmith shop with an intensity that suggested more than casual interest. "Mark my words," Eleanor told her housekeeper, Mrs. Crawley, as they observed from behind lace curtains. "That woman didn't stumble into Copper Ridge by accident. She's here for something specific, and I intend to find out what." Meanwhile, Ayanna sat on the wooden steps of the schoolhouse, exactly where he'd positioned himself every day for the past 6 months. Mrs. Henderson had long since stopped trying to coax him inside during recess, accepting that the boy preferred his silent vigil to the cheerful chaos of children at play. But today was different. Today, Ayanna's blank stare had found a focus. Winona had approached the schoolhouse to ask Mrs. Henderson about possible work, and as she spoke with the teacher, she became aware of the small figure watching her with an intensity that raised goosebumps along her arms. When their eyes met, something passed between them, not words, not gestures, but a recognition that defied explanation. She excused herself from the conversation and walked slowly toward Ayanna, each step measured and careful, like approaching a wounded animal that might bolt at any sudden movement. The other children, sensing something significant, had stopped their games to watch. Mrs. Henderson pressed her hand to her chest, hardly daring to breathe. When Winona reached the boy, she knelt down so their eyes were level. For a long moment they simply looked at each other. Then, without speaking, she extended her hand, palm up, fingers relaxed, an invitation rather than a demand. The silence stretched until it felt like the whole town was holding its breath. Somewhere in the distance a roadrunner called its harsh cry, and the wind rattled the dry leaves of a struggling cottonwood tree. Ayanna stared at the outstretched hand as if it were the most fascinating thing in the world. And then, for the first time in 6 months, he moved with purpose. His small hand lifted from his knee and slowly, deliberately, settled into Winona's palm. The moment their hands touched, something shifted in the very air of Copper Ridge, as if the desert itself had been holding its breath and finally exhaled. Mrs. Henderson later swore she heard a sound like distant music, though when pressed she couldn't say whether it was real or just the sound of hope returning to a place that had forgotten what it felt like. Ayanna didn't speak, didn't smile, but his fingers curled around Winona's with a trust that made the watching adults want to weep. The boy who had pulled away from every attempted embrace since his mother's funeral now held tight to this stranger's hand, as if she were a lifeline thrown to a drowning man. "Well, I'll be," whispered Grandfather Mape, leaning heavily on his walking stick as he watched from the shade of the general store. At 75, he'd seen enough of life to recognize the sacred when it appeared in unexpected forms. "That child ain't moved for nobody since the funeral. Not for his daddy, not for his teacher, not for pie or promises or prayers." Word of the encounter spread through the town like ripples in a still pond. By the time Dakota emerged from his blacksmith shop, wiping soot-stained hands on his leather apron, a small crowd had gathered at a respectful distance from the schoolhouse steps. He saw his son, really saw him, for the first time in months. Ayanna was sitting up straighter, his hollow eyes focused and alert, his small hand still clasped in the stranger's weathered palm. "Who is she?" Dakota asked Mrs. Henderson, his voice rough with emotions he couldn't name. "Says her name's Winona Hart, looking for work." The teacher's eyes never left the pair on the steps. "Dakota, in all my years teaching, I've never seen anything like this. It's as if she spoke to him without saying a word." Eleanor Blackwood had also witnessed the scene, and where others saw miracle, she saw threat. Standing in the doorway of Walsh's general store, her sharp mind was already calculating the implications of this development. For 6 months, she'd been subtly maneuvering to position herself as Ayanna's salvation, offering to take the boy into her grand house where he could be properly cared for by someone with the means to provide for him. The fact that this would also give her leverage over Dakota, the one man in town who'd never shown proper deference to her wealth and status, was simply a fortunate coincidence. But now this drifter had accomplished in minutes what Eleanor had failed to achieve in months of careful planning. The boy who wouldn't respond to her finest toys and sweetest treats had given his trust to a woman who looked like she hadn't had a decent meal in weeks. "There's something unnatural about this," Eleanor announced to anyone within earshot, her voice pitched to Carrie. "Mark my words, no good will come of it." "Women like that." She paused, letting the implication hang in the air. "They prey on the vulnerable, on grieving families." But even as she spoke, she could see that her words weren't taking root as easily as she'd hoped. Too many people had witnessed the gentleness in Winona's approach, the way she'd moved slowly and waited for Ayanna's permission before making contact. There was nothing predatory about it, nothing that suggested manipulation or harm. Reverend Chayton Whitmore, however, found himself deeply troubled by what he'd witnessed. Something about the scene stirred memories he'd spent 20 years trying to bury. Memories of another woman who'd had an unusual way with troubled souls, and the terrible price she'd paid for being different in a world that feared what it couldn't understand. That evening, as the desert sun painted the sky in shades of copper and gold, Dakota made a decision that would change everything. He approached Winona as she sat beside Ayanna on the church steps, both of them watching the sunset in comfortable silence. "Miss Hart," he said, removing his hat and running nervous fingers through his dark hair, "I'd like to offer you work. Housekeeping, cooking, looking after the boy. The pay isn't much, but you'd have a roof over your head and 3 meals a day." Winona looked up at him with eyes that seemed older than her years. "Mr. Mitchell, I appreciate the offer, but I should tell you, I'm not sure how long I'll be staying in Copper Ridge." "That's honest of you," Dakota replied. "But I've watched my boy for 6 months, and this is the first time I've seen him present, really present. If you're willing to stay even for a short while, it might be enough to help him find his way back to us." For the first time since her arrival, Winona smiled, a small, sad expression that held both hope and sorrow. "I'll stay As long as I'm needed," she said quietly. "And as long as I'm welcome." Neither of them noticed Eleanor Blackwood watching from her mansion window, her face twisted with an emotion that was equal parts rage and desperation. Change was coming to Copper Ridge, and she would be damned if she'd let some penniless drifter upset the careful order she'd spent years establishing. The first week of Winona's presence in the Mitchell household brought changes so subtle they might have been imagined, if not for the fact that Ayanna had begun to eat his meals without being coaxed. It wasn't much. A few extra spoonfuls of stew, a piece of cornbread consumed without leaving most of it scattered across his plate. But for a father who'd watched his son waste away for 6 months, it felt like witnessing resurrection. Winona moved through the small adobe house like a ghost trying to remember how to be human. She cleaned with methodical precision, cooked simple but nourishing meals, and mended clothes with stitches so fine they seemed to disappear into the fabric. But it was the way she existed around Ayanna that captured Dakota's attention. She never pushed, never demanded response, never filled the silence with empty chatter. Instead, she simply was, a steady presence that asked for nothing and somehow gave everything. On the third day, Dakota came home from the forge to find Ayanna sitting at the kitchen table with a piece of charcoal in his hand, making marks on brown paper. It was the first time the boy had shown interest in anything beyond staring at the walls since Sarah's death. The drawing was crude, childish, but unmistakably a woman with long, dark hair and a kind face. "That's beautiful," Winona said softly, not looking directly at the drawing, but continuing to fold laundry nearby. "Your mama would be proud to see you drawing again." Ayanna's hand stilled on the paper, and for a moment Dakota thought his son might finally speak. Instead, the boy carefully tore the drawing from the paper and placed it on the chair where Winona usually sat during meals. The message was clear. The drawing was for her. Word of the boy's improvement spread through Copper Ridge with the speed that only good news in a hard place can achieve. Mrs. Henderson reported that Ayanna was attending school again, though he still hadn't spoken. The doctor, such as he was, proclaimed it a sign that grief was finally loosening its grip. Grandfather Mape nodded wisely and muttered something about the healing power of kindred spirits. But not everyone was pleased with the developments. Eleanor Blackwood had spent considerable time and money positioning herself as the town's benefactress, the refined lady who could provide guidance and stability to families in crisis. She'd already mentally redecorated the spare room in her mansion for Ayanna, imagining how grateful Dakota would be when she offered to take the burden of raising his damaged son off his shoulders. The boy's improvement under Winona's care wasn't just inconvenient, it was humiliating. "I tell you, there's something unnatural about that woman," Eleanor confided to Mrs. Crawley as they prepared for the weekly ladies' auxiliary meeting. "Children don't just start healing because some drifter shows up and plays house. There's more to this story, and I intend to find out what it is." Her first attempt at investigation was direct. She invited Winona to tea, ostensibly to welcome her to the community, but actually to probe for information about her past. Winona arrived at the appointed time, dressed in her one good dress, a faded blue garment that had seen better years but was clean and carefully mended. "Such a lovely home you have, Mrs. Blackwood," Winona said, accepting a cup of tea with hands that barely trembled, despite the obvious intimidation factor of the grand parlor with its imported furniture and crystal chandelier. "Thank you, dear. I do try to maintain certain standards." Eleanor's smile was sharp as broken glass. "Now then, tell me about yourself. Where did you come from before arriving in our little town?" "I've been traveling for some time," Winona replied, her voice steady but revealing nothing. "Looking for a place where I might be useful." "How interesting. And your family? Surely someone is wondering where you've gone?" For the first time, something flickered across Winona's composed features, a shadow of pain so brief it might have been imagined. "I have no family left, Mrs. Blackwood. The cholera took them, same as it took so many others." Eleanor leaned forward, sensing vulnerability. "How tragic. And yet, you seem to have such a natural way with children. One might think you'd had children of your own." The teacup rattled slightly as Winona set it down. "I did have a child once, a little girl. She was taken by the fever when she was 5 years old." The admission hung in the air like incense, heavy with grief and memory. Eleanor felt a moment of unexpected sympathy before her calculating nature reasserted itself. A woman who'd lost a child might be even more dangerous around other people's children, driven by desperate need to fill the void in her heart. Meanwhile, Reverend Chayton Whitmore was conducting his own investigation, though his motives were murkier even to himself. Something about Winona stirred memories he'd spent decades trying to suppress, memories of his younger sister Rebecca, who'd had an unusual gift for calming distressed animals and reading the emotions of others. Rebecca had been burned as a witch 20 years earlier in a town not so different from Copper Ridge, and Chayton had been too weak, too cowardly to speak in her defense. He began to notice things about Winona that others missed. The way she hummed old songs under her breath, melodies that sounded familiar but couldn't quite be placed. The fact that she knew which herbs grew wild in the desert, and how to brew them into teas that seemed to ease various ailments. Most troubling of all, the way she sometimes seemed to know things she shouldn't, like when Mrs. Patterson's baby was coming down with fever before the child showed any symptoms. The breaking point came on a Sunday after church services. Ayanna had begun attending again, sitting silently beside Winona and Takota in the back pew. After the service, as people mingled outside the small chapel, young Tommy Walsh, Jeremiah's grandson, fell from the church steps and scraped his knee badly enough to draw blood and tears. Before anyone else could react, Winona was kneeling beside the boy, her hands gentle as she examined the wound. She spoke to him in a voice so soft that others had to strain to hear, but whatever she said calmed his crying immediately. From somewhere in her skirts, she produced a clean cloth and a small bottle of what looked like water, but smelled faintly of herbs. "This might sting a little at first," she warned, "but then it'll feel much better." Tommy nodded bravely and sat still as she cleaned and bandaged the scrape with practiced efficiency. Within minutes, he was smiling and thanking her before running off to rejoin his friends, apparently pain-free. "Where did you learn to do that?" Mrs. Walsh asked, her voice tight with suspicion. "My grandmother was a healer," Winona replied simply. "She taught me a few things before she passed." But Reverend Chayton heard something else in those words, an echo of the same explanation his sister had given 20 years ago when people questioned her unusual knowledge, and Eleanor Blackwood, watching from across the churchyard, saw opportunity in the growing murmurs of the crowd. The seeds of fear had been planted. Now they just needed the right conditions to grow. 3 weeks into Winona's stay at the Mitchell house, the miracle everyone had been hoping for finally happened, though it came wrapped in circumstances that would divide the town more deeply than the war between the states ever had. It began with a thunderstorm, one of those rare desert tempests that turn the sky black as midnight and send torrents of water cascading through arroyos that had been bone dry for months. Ayanna had always been terrified of thunder, even before his mother's death. But since Sarah's passing, storms sent him into a state of mute panic that could last for days. Takota was at the forge when the first fat raindrops began to fall, hurrying to bank his fires and secure his tools before the deluge began in earnest. He could hear the thunder rolling across the desert like cannon fire, growing closer with each rumble, and his heart clenched with worry for his son. By the time he made it home, running through streets that were already turning to rivers of mud, the storm was directly overhead. He burst through the door, expecting to find Ayanna cowering in some corner, trembling and unreachable as he'd been during every storm since the funeral. Instead, he found his son sitting calmly at the kitchen table while Winona prepared supper, the boy's small hands busy with another drawing. "How?" Dakota began, but Winona just smiled and nodded toward the window where lightning was still flashing across the sky. "He's been drawing pictures of the thunder," she said quietly. "I told him that storms are just the sky's way of crying, and sometimes crying helps wash away the sadness so new things can grow." As if summoned by her words, Ayanna looked up from his drawing and spoke his first words in 7 months. "Mama used to say the thunder was angels bowling in heaven." The sound of his voice, thin and rusty from disuse but unmistakably his own, hit Dakota like a physical blow. He dropped to his knees beside his son's chair, tears streaming down his weathered face, afraid to breathe for fear of breaking whatever spell had returned his boy's voice. "She did say that," Dakota whispered. "She said they must be having quite a tournament up there whenever the storms got real loud." Ayanna nodded solemnly. "I think Mama's winning. She was always good at games." The moment should have been perfect, should have been the happy ending they'd all been praying for. And it was, until Eleanor Blackwood arrived. She appeared at their door 20 minutes later, claiming she'd come to check on them during the storm, though her immaculate appearance suggested she'd taken considerable care to avoid getting wet. Her eyes immediately fixed on Ayanna, who was chattering quietly to Winona about his drawings, and her face went through a series of expressions: surprise, calculation, and something darker that might have been rage. "My word," she said, her voice honey-sweet and venomous. "The boy is speaking. How miraculous." "Isn't it wonderful?" Dakota said, too overwhelmed with joy to notice the undercurrents in Eleanor's tone. "Winona, I don't know how to thank you. This is more than I ever dared hope for." Eleanor's smile could have cut glass. "Yes, I imagine it is. Tell me, Miss Hart, exactly what methods did you use to achieve such remarkable results?" There was something in the way she said it that made Winona look up sharply. "I don't understand what you're asking, Mrs. Blackwood." "Oh, I think you do. Children don't simply start speaking again after months of silence unless something very specific has happened. Some people might call it a miracle, but others—" She let the sentence hang in the air like smoke from a poisoned fire. Dakota felt the first chill of unease creep up his spine. "Eleanor, what are you suggesting?" "I'm not suggesting anything, Dakota. I'm simply observing that your housekeeper seems to have unusual abilities when it comes to influencing troubled minds. First the boy's eating improves, then his behavior, now his speech. One has to wonder what other influences she might be exerting." Ayanna had gone quiet again, sensing the tension in the room even if he didn't understand its source. Winona moved protectively closer to him, her face pale but determined. "Mrs. Blackwood, I've done nothing but try to make this child feel safe and cared for. If that's helped him heal, then I'm grateful, but there's nothing mysterious about it. Isn't there?" Eleanor's voice had dropped to a whisper that somehow carried more menace than a shout. "Tell me, Miss Hart, where exactly did you learn your healing techniques? From your grandmother, was it? The same grandmother who taught you which herbs to use and how to read the pain in people's eyes?" The storm outside had moved on, but the one in the Mitchell kitchen was just beginning. Dakota looked between the two women, beginning to understand that this confrontation had been building since the day Winona arrived. "Eleanor, I think you should leave," he said quietly. "Oh, I'll leave, Dakota, but I won't be the only one. By tomorrow, this entire town will know exactly what kind of woman you've welcomed into your home, what kind of influence you've allowed around your precious son." She turned to go, then paused at the door. "You know, There was another woman like this once, in a town about 100 miles north of here. She had the same gifts, the same way with troubled children and frightened animals. Do you know what happened to her, Miss Hart?" Winona's face had gone white as desert bones. "Mrs. Blackwood, please." "They burned her," Eleanor said with satisfaction. "Right in the middle of the town square, while good Christian people watched and prayed for their souls to be cleansed of her evil influence." The door slammed behind her, leaving the small family in stunned silence. Outside, the last of the thunder rumbled away into the distance, but the echo of Eleanor's words seemed to hang in the air like a curse. Ayanna looked up at Winona with wide, frightened eyes. "Are you going to leave us too?" he whispered. Winona knelt beside his chair and took his small hands in hers. "Not if I can help it, sweetheart." "Not if I can help it." But even as she spoke the words, she could feel the weight of history pressing down on her shoulders, and she wondered if love would be enough to protect them from the storm that was coming. Eleanor Blackwood's poison worked faster than desert wildfire. By the next morning, whispers followed Winona like shadows wherever she went in Copper Ridge. The baker's wife crossed herself when Winona entered the shop. The blacksmith's apprentice dropped his tools and fled when she passed the forge. Children who had begun to wave shyly at the kind woman now hid behind their mothers' skirts, eyes wide with the fear that only adults can teach. But it was the gathering at the church that night that transformed whispers into something far more dangerous. Eleanor had called for a special meeting of the town council, ostensibly to discuss threats to the moral fabric of our community. She'd spent the day visiting every household, sharing carefully chosen details about Winona's unusual knowledge of herbs, her uncanny ability to calm distressed animals, and most damning of all, her mysterious appearance in town just as Ayanna began his miraculous recovery. "I'm not saying she's a witch," Eleanor told the assembled crowd, her voice pitched perfectly to suggest exactly that while maintaining plausible deniability. "I'm simply saying that we've all seen what happened to other towns that ignored the warning signs. Remember what happened up in Silver Creek 20 years ago?" A murmur of unease rippled through the crowd. Everyone knew the story of Silver Creek. How a woman with unusual gifts had bewitched the town's children, how the crops had failed and the mine had collapsed, how they'd finally been forced to drive her out to save themselves. Most people suspected the story had grown in the telling, but Eleanor's words made it feel immediate and real. Reverend Chayton stood at the front of the church, his hands trembling as he gripped the pulpit. The resemblance between Winona and his long-dead sister had been haunting him for weeks, and Eleanor's accusations had awakened memories he'd spent decades trying to bury. In his nightmares, he could still hear Rebecca's voice calling his name as the flames consumed her, still see the accusation in her eyes when he'd stood silent among her condemners. "We must be careful not to let fear cloud our judgment," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "The Lord teaches us to show mercy to strangers, for we know not if they be angels in disguise." "Angels?" Eleanor's laugh was sharp as broken glass. "Angels don't skulk into town with no past and no references. Angels don't heal with strange potions and unnatural knowledge. And angels certainly don't work their influence on innocent children in ways that defy explanation." "The boy is better," protested Mrs. Henderson from the back of the church. "For the first time in months, Ayanna is speaking, eating, living again. Surely that's the Lord's work, not the devil's." "Is it?" Eleanor's voice rose dramatically. "Or have we simply witnessed the first step in some darker plan?" Think about it. What better way to gain our trust than to appear to heal our most vulnerable? What better way to work her way into the heart of our community than through a grieving father's desperate love for his child? The crowd was beginning to turn, fear overcoming reason as it always did when people felt their world threatened by forces they couldn't understand. Voices rose in agreement, sharing half-remembered tales of strange women and cursed towns, each story growing darker in the telling. Dakota Mitchell chose that moment to enter the church, his face grim with determination. Behind him came Winona, pale but resolute, and between them Ayanna clutched both their hands with the fierce grip of a child who understood that his family was under attack. "I hear you're holding a trial for the woman who saved my son's life," Dakota said, his voice cutting through the noise like a blade. "I thought I might have something to say about that." Eleanor's eyes glittered with triumph. She'd been hoping Dakota would appear. His defense of Winona would only make the town's ultimate rejection of both of them more complete. "By all means, Dakota. Tell us about the miracles you've witnessed. Tell us how a complete stranger accomplished what months of prayer and medicine could not." Dakota looked around the church at faces he'd known for years, people he'd worked for, traded with, called friends. Now they stared back at him with expressions ranging from pity to suspicion to outright hostility. "I'll tell you what I've witnessed," he said quietly. "I've watched a woman show more kindness to my boy in 3 weeks than some of you have shown in 6 months. I've seen her work from dawn to dusk without complaint, asking for nothing but a chance to help. And yes, I've seen my son come back to life under her care." "That's exactly what we're afraid of," someone called from the crowd. "How do we know what else she's brought back with her? What other influences might be at work?" Ayanna suddenly pulled free from his father's grip and walked to the front of the church. In the silence that followed, his young voice rang out clear and strong. "She's not scary. She just listens when people are sad, like Mama used to do." The simple words hung in the air like a prayer, innocent and true. For a moment the crowd wavered, remembering their own humanity, but Eleanor Blackwood had not spent years building her power base to see it crumble before a child's testimony. "Out of the mouths of babes," she said with false sympathy. "Children are so easily influenced, aren't they? So quick to trust those who mean them harm." That was when Reverend Chayton Whitmore finally found his courage. 20 years too late, but perhaps not too late to matter. "Stop." The word came from Reverend Chayton Whitmore with such force that it silenced the entire church. His hands were shaking as he stepped down from the pulpit, his weathered face pale as parchment in the lamplight. "I cannot. I will not let this happen again." The congregation stared at their spiritual leader in confusion. Eleanor's eyes narrowed dangerously, sensing that her carefully orchestrated mob was about to slip from her control. "Reverend Whitmore," she said smoothly, "surely you're not suggesting we ignore the clear signs of—" "20 years ago," Chayton interrupted, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I stood in another church, in another town, and watched good people convince themselves that fear was the same as faith. I watched them build a pyre in the town square and burn a woman whose only crime was being different." A collective gasp rippled through the crowd. This was not a story any of them had heard before, and the raw anguish in their minister's voice made it impossible to dismiss. "Her name was Rebecca," he continued, tears streaming down his weathered cheeks. "Rebecca Whitmore. She was my sister." The revelation hit the assembly like a physical blow. Eleanor's face had gone white with rage and something that might have been panic. "Your sister was a witch?" someone whispered from the back of the church. "My sister was a healer," Chayton said firmly. "She could calm frightened animals and ease the pain of suffering children. She knew which herbs would break a fever and which songs would comfort a grieving mother. And for those gifts, for her compassion and her difference, they called her a witch and burned her alive while I stood by and did nothing." He turned to face Winona directly, his eyes blazing with 20 years of accumulated guilt and grief. "I see her in you, Miss Hart. The same gentleness, the same instinct to heal rather than harm. And I swear by Almighty God that I will not stand silent again while good people destroy what they're too frightened to understand." Eleanor's carefully constructed case was crumbling, but she was far from finished. If she couldn't have the town's righteous anger, she would settle for their desperate need for someone to blame for all their accumulated suffering. "How touching," she said, her voice dripping with venom. But perhaps the good Reverend's judgment is clouded by guilt over his sister's fate. Perhaps he sees redemption where the rest of us see danger. She turned to address the crowd directly, her years of manipulating the town's emotions serving her well. "I've tried to warn you all gently, to let you reach your own conclusions. But since we're speaking plainly now, let me tell you what I know about your precious Winona Hart." Winona stiffened, and Dakota instinctively moved closer to her side. Ayanna pressed against his father's leg, sensing the darkness in Eleanor's tone, even if he couldn't understand its implications. "3 weeks ago," Eleanor continued, "I sent inquiries to towns along the territory's main routes, asking about a woman matching Miss Hart's description. The replies I received were illuminating." She pulled a folded paper from her reticule with theatrical precision. "Tombstone, Arizona. A woman calling herself Winona Hart worked briefly as a seamstress. Left town suddenly after the mayor's young son died of fever, the same fever she'd been treating with her herbal remedies." A murmur of unease swept through the church. Eleanor smiled and produced another letter. "Tucson. A woman of the same description worked as a housekeeper for a ranching family. Dismissed when their daughter began having nightmares about the lady who knows secrets. The child claimed the woman could read her thoughts." "These are lies," Winona said quietly, but her voice lacked conviction. Some part of Eleanor's story was true. Winona had been in those towns, though not under the circumstances Eleanor described. "Am I lying about the child who died in Tombstone?" Eleanor pressed. "Am I lying about the family in Tucson who feared for their daughter's sanity? Or am I simply the only one brave enough to connect the obvious pattern?" The crowd was turning again, fear overcoming the brief moment of doubt that Chayton's confession had created. Parents pulled their children closer, and several men had begun to edge toward the doors, perhaps to fetch ropes or torches. That was when Winona finally spoke, her voice cutting through the rising hysteria with the force of absolute truth. "Eleanor Blackwood is right about one thing," she said, standing straighter despite the hatred radiating from every corner of the church. "I have been in those towns. I was in Tombstone when little Michael Garrett died of fever. I was in Tucson when Emma Morrison started having nightmares." The admission hit the crowd like a lightning strike. Even Dakota stared at her in shock, his faith shaken by what sounded like a confession. "But what Mrs. Blackwood isn't telling you," Winona continued, her voice growing stronger, "is that Michael Garrett was already dying when I arrived. The fever had taken hold 3 days before I ever set foot in that town. I sat with him and his mother through his final night, holding his hand so he wouldn't die alone." She turned to face Eleanor directly, her dark eyes blazing with righteous anger. "And Emma Morrison wasn't having nightmares because of anything I did to her. She was having nightmares because her uncle was visiting her bed at night, and she was too frightened to tell anyone. The secrets she said I knew weren't supernatural. They were the bruises I saw on her arms and the fear in her eyes when any man came near her." The church had gone dead silent. Eleanor's face was a mask of cold fury, but something else flickered in her eyes, a desperation that suggested Winona's words had struck closer to home than anyone realized. "These are the stories Mrs. Blackwood wants you to believe," Winona said, addressing the entire congregation now. "That I'm some kind of evil influence, bringing death and madness wherever I go. But the truth is simpler and sadder than that. I'm just a woman who's buried her own child, who recognizes pain in others because I carry so much of my own." She knelt down beside Ayanna, taking his small hands in hers. This boy was dying inside, not from any curse or spell, but from a grief too large for his small heart to carry alone. All I did was sit with him the way I sat with Michael Garrett, the way I tried to sit with Emma Morrison. Sometimes that's all healing is, just refusing to let people suffer alone. But Eleanor Blackwood had one final card to play, one revelation that would shatter everything Winona had just built. "How very moving," she said, her voice deadly calm. "But you're still not telling them the whole truth, are you, Sarah?" The name hit the church like a thunderclap, and in the stunned silence that followed, Dakota's face went through a series of expressions that would haunt the witnesses for years to come. Confusion gave way to recognition, recognition to disbelief, and disbelief to a pain so raw it seemed to tear the very air around him. "Sarah?" he whispered, the word barely audible but carrying the weight of a prayer and a curse combined. Winona, or the woman they had known as Winona, closed her eyes as if absorbing a physical blow. When she opened them again, tears were streaming down her face, but her voice remained steady. "My name is Sarah Hart," she said quietly. "Sarah Mitchell died with her sister 6 months ago." The confession sent shock waves through the assembled crowd, but none felt it as powerfully as Ayanna, who had been listening with the special intensity that only children possess when they sense their world is about to change forever. "Mama?" The word escaped his lips like a sob, and suddenly he was launching himself at Winona with the desperate fury of a child who had been promised his mother was gone forever, only to discover she had been there all along, hiding behind a stranger's name and face. But it was Eleanor's triumphant laughter that cut through the emotional chaos like a blade. "Did you really think no one would figure it out?" she said, her voice ringing with satisfaction. "Sarah Mitchell supposedly died of cholera, but her body was never found, was it? Just buried quick and quiet during the height of the epidemic, when everyone was too frightened to ask questions." Dakota stared at the woman he had buried, the woman he had mourned, the woman he had hired to care for his son without recognizing her as the mother who had given him birth. His mind reeled, trying to make sense of what seemed impossible. "You let me grieve you," he said, his voice breaking. "You let our son believe his mother was dead." "And you watched me bury an empty coffin and you said nothing, because I was dead," Sarah replied, her voice thick with tears. "The woman you married, the woman who sang lullabies and baked bread and believed the world was a place where love could conquer anything. She died the night the fever took our daughter." The revelation hit the crowd like another thunderbolt. A daughter? There had been no daughter in the Mitchell family, no mention of a lost child. "What daughter?" Mrs. Henderson asked, her teacher's instinct for missing pieces compelling her to speak, despite the tension crackling through the air. Sarah's face crumpled with grief so profound it seemed to age her decades in seconds. "Mary Elizabeth Mitchell, born 3 months before the cholera came. She lived for 5 weeks before the fever took her." Dakota's legs gave out and he sank into the nearest pew as memories came flooding back, memories he had buried so deep he had almost convinced himself they were dreams. The tiny coffin he had built with his own hands, the grave they had dug beside the church, the way Sarah had stopped eating, stopped speaking, stopped living even while her body continued to draw breath. "You did die," he whispered, understanding beginning to dawn. "Not from cholera, but from losing Mary. You couldn't bear it." "I couldn't bear anything," Sarah confirmed. "So I became someone else. I left Copper Ridge in the middle of the night and became Winona Hart, a woman with no past, no memories, no pain. I told myself I was protecting you and Ayanna from having to watch me die slowly." "But you came back," Ayanna said, his voice small but determined. "You came back because you heard me calling for you." Sarah knelt down to meet her son's eyes, her hands trembling as she reached for him. "Every night, sweetheart. I heard you calling every night, and it nearly killed me all over again. But I thought you were better off believing I was gone than living with the broken shell I had become." Eleanor watched this reunion with the cold calculation of a predator whose prey had escaped the trap. She had expected Sarah's revelation to destroy the Mitchell family permanently, to discredit Winona so thoroughly that no one would ever trust her again. Instead, she was witnessing something that looked dangerously like forgiveness and healing. "How touching," she said, her voice cutting through the tender moment like a scythe through wheat. "But this doesn't change anything. If anything, it makes everything worse. A woman who would abandon her own family, fake her own death, and return under false pretenses, what else is she capable of?" The crowd, which had been softening toward the impossible love story unfolding before them, began to murmur agreement. Eleanor was right. What kind of woman could do such things? What kind of mother could put her husband and child through such suffering? "You want to know what else I'm capable of?" Sarah said, rising to face Eleanor with a strength that seemed to come from finally dropping the last of her pretenses. "I'm capable of recognizing a woman who would rather destroy a family than admit she's not the savior she pretends to be." Eleanor's face went white. "How dare you?" "I know about your son, Eleanor," Sarah continued relentlessly. "The real reason he died, not from fever, not from accident, but because you couldn't bear the thought of him loving anyone more than he loved you." The church went dead silent. Even Eleanor's most loyal supporters stared at her in shock as the accusation hung in the air like poison gas. "That's a lie," Eleanor whispered, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it?" Sarah's voice was gentle now, sad rather than accusatory. "Tell them about the pillow, Eleanor. Tell them about how you held it over little Thomas's face while he slept, telling yourself it was mercy, that you were saving him from a world that would never understand his love for his nanny." Eleanor's composure finally cracked completely. "He was mine," she screamed, her voice echoing off the church walls. "My son, my blood, and he chose that Mexican girl over me. He ran to her when he was frightened, called her name when he was hurt. A servant. He loved a servant more than his own mother." The confession hung in the air like a death knell. In admitting her motivation, Eleanor had confirmed the terrible truth that Sarah had somehow divined. The most respected woman in Copper Ridge was a child killer, driven by jealousy so consuming it had turned love into murder. And in that moment of horrific revelation, Sarah Mitchell found her voice, her purpose, and her family all at once. The truth hung in the desert air like heat lightning, illuminating everything that had been hidden in shadow. Eleanor Blackwood's confession echoed off the adobe walls of the church, each word a hammer blow that shattered the careful facade she had maintained for years. The woman who had positioned herself as Copper Ridge's moral guardian, its protector of children and families, stood revealed as the very monster she had accused others of being. "Sweet Jesus," whispered Grandfather Maupe, his weathered hands gripping his walking stick so tightly his knuckles had gone white. "Eleanor, what have you done?" But Eleanor was beyond hearing, beyond shame, beyond anything but the raw fury that had driven her to confess her darkest secret. Her carefully arranged hair had come loose from its pins. Her expensive dress was wrinkled from her violent gestures, and her eyes held the wild gleam of someone who had finally stopped pretending to be human. "You think you understand?" she snarled at Sarah, advancing down the church aisle like an avenging angel gone mad. "You think your pretty little tragedy gives you the right to judge me? I gave that boy everything. The finest clothes, the best education money could buy, toys from back east that other children could only dream of. And what did I get in return?" Her voice broke into a sound that was part laugh, part sob. I got a son who cried for his nanny when he scraped his knee, who ran to her arms when thunderstorms frightened him, who saved his brightest smiles and sweetest words for a girl who couldn't even speak proper English. The congregation watched in horrified fascination as the most powerful woman in their community unraveled before their eyes. Several people had begun backing toward the doors, sensing that Eleanor's madness might turn violent at any moment. "So yes," she continued, her voice rising to a shriek, "I held the pillow over his face until he stopped breathing. I told myself it was mercy, that I was saving him from a world that would never appreciate what he was, never understand the love I had given him. But the truth is simpler than that. If I couldn't have his love, then no one could." Dakota had been listening to this confession with the numb shock of a man watching his entire world reshape itself around unthinkable revelations. But now, seeing Eleanor advancing on his wife and son with murder in her eyes, he found his voice and his purpose. "That's enough," he said, stepping between Eleanor and his family. "It's over, Eleanor. Whatever you thought you could gain by destroying us, it's finished now." Eleanor laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "Oh, but it's not finished, Dakota. Not until everyone pays for what they've taken from me. Starting with your precious, reunited family." From somewhere in the folds of her dress, she produced a small pearl-handled pistol, the kind wealthy ladies carried for protection against bandits and wild animals. In Eleanor's trembling grip, it looked like a toy, but everyone in the church knew it was perfectly capable of ending lives. "You want to know what I'm capable of?" she said, echoing Sarah's earlier words with bitter mockery. "Let me show you." She aimed the gun directly at Ayanna, who stood frozen between his parents like a small statue carved from fear. "If I can't have a child who loves me, then neither can you." The next few seconds unfolded with the strange, crystalline clarity that sometimes accompanies moments of absolute crisis. Reverend Chayton started forward, his voice raised in a prayer or a protest. Mrs. Henderson screamed. Grandfather Moppy began struggling to his feet despite his age and infirmity. But it was Sarah who moved fastest, throwing herself between the gun and her son with the fierce instinct of a mother who had already lost one child and would die before losing another. The shot rang out like thunder in the confined space of the church, the sound so loud it seemed to stop time itself. Sarah staggered, but remained standing, her hand pressed to her shoulder where a dark stain was beginning to spread across her simple dress. Eleanor stared at the gun in her hand as if she'd never seen it before, her face cycling through expressions of shock, satisfaction, and dawning horror. The act of pulling the trigger seemed to have broken whatever final thread had been holding her sanity together. "I didn't mean," she began, then stopped. "No, that's not true. I did mean it. I meant all of it." But before she could raise the gun again, strong hands seized her from behind. Jeremiah Walsh, the wagon driver who had brought Sarah to Copper Ridge all those weeks ago, wrestled the weapon away from her with the matter-of-fact efficiency of a man who had dealt with dangerous animals and desperate people throughout his long life. "That's quite enough excitement for one evening," he said calmly, as if he were commenting on an unusually dramatic church social rather than a murder attempt. The spell that had held the congregation frozen finally broke, and suddenly everyone was moving at once. Dr. Hartwell, sober for once in his life thanks to the shocking nature of the evening's events, pushed through the crowd to examine Sarah's wound. Several of the younger men stepped forward to help Jeremiah secure Eleanor, who had collapsed into a chair and was staring at nothing with the vacant expression of someone whose mind had simply decided to stop processing reality. "The shoulder's not too bad," Dr. Hartwell announced after a quick examination. "Bullet went clean through, missed the bone. She'll be sore for a few weeks, but she'll live." Ayanna, who had been standing paralyzed with shock, suddenly threw himself at his mother with a force that nearly knocked her over despite her injury. "Don't leave again, Mama," he sobbed into her skirt. "Please don't ever leave again." Sarah wrapped her good arm around her son and looked over his head at Dakota, who was staring at her with an expression that combined love, confusion, relief, and about a dozen other emotions too complex to name. "I won't leave," she promised, and for the first time in months her words carried the weight of absolute truth. "I'm done running from the pain. It's time to start healing instead." And in that moment, with Eleanor's madness finally exposed and contained, with the truth finally spoken after months of deception and fear, the small family began the long, difficult work of becoming whole again. Sometimes we think we're protecting the ones we love by hiding our pain, by becoming someone else entirely rather than facing the grief that threatens to consume us. But real love isn't about perfection. It's about having the courage to be broken together and heal together. Like Sarah and Dakota Mitchell, many of us have walked away from our own lives when the weight of loss felt unbearable, only to discover that running from pain doesn't end it. It just spreads it to the people who need us most. What moment in your life taught you that hiding your struggles only made them heavier? Have you ever found that the very thing you thought would destroy your family actually became the foundation for a deeper, more honest love?